we'll go ahead and get started here. Kelly will put up the passages I read. I didn't set it up for her this time like I did last time, so she'll have to follow along. She won't be able to daydream back there like she normally does. Okay, so 2 weeks ago, well, it was last week for me, but 2 weeks ago for you, so the theory of relativity works. Everything is relative to when you're on vacation. 2 weeks ago we talked about forgiveness. Went through some of the text on dealing with that issue on forgiveness. And I understand, and so let me just kind of go over a little bit some of the conversation I had with like Joseph and Madison, and then also some others. They weren't the only ones and I understand that there's two ways for us to look or think about forgiveness, and they're both legitimate. I'm not trying to delegitimize how the different way we can look at it. So there's a populist way, the way you and I would use the word and the ideas of forgiveness every day and how we would think of that. And then there's the way in which it actually works, right? And even though the way we would use it in a popular sense is not the way it really works, it's legitimate to think about that because we're expressing something different. We're really talking about our feelings. We're talking about our peace of mind. We're talking about those kind of things, and we're using terms that are not technically accurate, okay? And that's fine. That's like when you and I talk about maybe how we feel in our health. We're not doctors, and we're probably not really using the terminology all that accurately, but we're describing something that's very true to us. So that's okay. But if we want to talk about what forgiveness actually is and what does or does not happen, well, then we have to be technical about that issue. And technically, the way you and I tend to use the word and the term and the idea of forgiveness is not accurate. So you may think, well, I don't know if I really forgave that person because I still feel bitter towards them. Okay, I understand what you're saying. And if we pretend those words don't mean what they mean, then that's perfectly an accurate statement. I understand what you're saying. However, if you loose something on earth, it is loosed in heaven, whether 2 years later you think, well, maybe I didn't forgive. There is no difference in my mind. Now, you may disagree, that's fine. I find there to be no difference between the person who says, I forgive you, and then thinks, well, maybe I really didn't forgive him because I still feel bitterness. To the person who says, I asked Jesus to save me, but now I don't think he really did, so maybe I'm not saved. I think it's the same thing, right? Just because you feel like you may not have forgiven someone does not mean that transaction that according to Jesus takes place in heaven changes because you don't feel like it really happened. I don't find any difference there, okay? Now, I understand what you're expressing, and that is a separate issue. I'm not saying that doesn't exist. It just doesn't have anything to do with real forgiveness. Real forgiveness is a person who has been wronged making a transaction by which the person who did the bad deed is no longer held accountable in judgment. It is a legal absolution of guilt. And your feelings do not actually have any bearing on that matter whatsoever. Now, that does not mean that if you truly forgive somebody, that'll change your feelings. See, that's what we want out of this. We want to be able to forgive somebody and it change how we feel about things. And that would be wonderful if it worked that way. But it isn't how it works. Forgiveness doesn't actually change anybody's feelings about anything at all. And so our feelings about situations have zero bearing on whether or not forgiveness has taken place. And so, like I said, to me, the parallel example is that Jesus Christ has forgiven us. That doesn't always change the way we feel about things or the way other people feel about us. None of that changes. This is a legal transaction. right? This is an accounting transaction. Accounts have been changed, and that will be reflected in judgment, not necessarily in how we feel about things. So, moving on from there, let's talk about this idea of bitterness. Now, I understand that bitterness is a serious issue. It can seriously affect your quality of life. It can affect your quality of faith. It can affect even your health. So it is obviously something real behind that. However, again, when we look at the scripture, we need to determine whether or not we are talking about our popular culture version of things, or are we going to talk about the way the Bible talks about things. This is not to say that there's anything wrong with using these terms in a popular way, but we cannot conflate that with how the Scripture uses these terms. We have to be able to balance those and say, okay, if we're going to talk about this and you're going to lay on the couch and I'm going to listen to your woes and I'm going to tell you, you need to learn to not be bitter. We all know what we're talking about. You need to try not to have hurt feelings towards somebody else. That's what we're saying. That isn't what the Bible's talking about when it's talking about bitterness. That isn't what it's talking about. It's not talking about your feelings again. So, we have to differentiate these differences. So, there's actually two texts by which most people try to conflate the relieving of bitterness with forgiveness. And we're going to look at those. And then there's one other that doesn't mention bitterness, but most people put that in there also. So we're going to look at these three texts and look at how it's talking about this. So let's start in the main one, which is which is Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 11. Now, this is the passage that's most often quoted associating bitterness with forgiveness, even though the text and context is never used. It's really just the little short phrase that we all love, and we take that and we appropriate it and apply it to the idea that if you forgive somebody, it's going to change the way you feel about what happened. So, Hebrews chapter 12, we're going to start reading in verse 11. He says, "Now, no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. Wherefore lift up the hands which hang down, and the feeble knees, and make straight paths for your feet, lest that which is lame be turned out of the way, but let it rather be healed. Follow peace with all men, and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord. Looking diligently, lest any man fail of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled. Lest there be any fornicator or profane person, as Esau, who for one morsel of meat sold his birthright." The root of bitterness. That's the phrase that is often associated with the idea that if you have bitterness towards somebody who's wronged you, it's because you haven't truly forgiven them. Now, never mentions forgiveness in this text. In fact, it doesn't mention forgiveness anywhere in the book. This is one of the books of the Bible that never talks about that, never uses the word. This is why I emphasize and re-emphasize and overemphasize we must read in context. Just because you read the word bitterness and it computes one way in your mind does not mean that what you think bitterness is accurate, or that everywhere that word appears is talking about what you think it's talking about. It is not honoring to the Scriptures to rip 3 words out of context and make an entire doctrine based on it and make Christians think that somehow they haven't really forgiven everybody they've forgiven because of how they feel about them. This is, I think, extremely detrimental to the Scriptures themselves. So what is he talking about here? Okay. Well, first of all, he's not talking about forgiveness. And he's certainly not talking about how you feel about somebody who's wronged you. There is nowhere in this context that if you were to say, okay, forget about everything I think, when I hear the term root of bitterness, I'm going to put aside all my presuppositions about that. And I'm just going to look at the text and say, what is he talking about? He is not talking about anyone who has wronged you. He is not talking about anyone who has offended you. He's not talking about anything like that at all. There's nothing in the context to take us there. We are just assuming because we read bitterness and the root of bitterness that we're saying if you hold something against somebody who's done you wrong and you don't forgive them freely and feel like no resentment towards them, then you are bringing in a root of nastiness into the church that's going to defile everybody and it's going to ruin the church. That's the presupposition. That's how it's taught too many times. And if that's what it would say, I'd be fine. I have no problem with that being accurate. But it isn't what it says. And it's not at all what he's talking about. At all. He is talking about something entirely different here. Why is it so problematic? Why do I have such vitriol against taking these things out of context? Because Paul went to a lot of trouble to write something that he thought was important. And if we take these things out of context and apply them to what they aren't, we not only are inserting our inspiration into the text, we are blanking out his. It's a double problem. We are putting in what we think it ought to say, and we're erasing what it actually does say. So we lose twice. So to me, it's very important that as we look at these things, we be very careful and very critical and say, is it possible that I have bought into a pop culture version of what he's saying here? And I've not truly analyzed what he's trying to get across. And I think that's the case in this text. So what is he talking about here? Let's look at this briefly. So it's interesting, the phrase he uses. He says that we need to be diligent, we need to look, and we need to be very attentive would be the way of saying that, looking diligent. Be attentive, pay attention, right? Lest any man fail of the grace of God, and then lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you. I want you to notice, and we don't have time to go through the full context, why we didn't read the full context like I would have liked to, because it's basically the whole chapter. But what he's talking about here is a collective danger, right, that he deals with in the entire book of Hebrews. In that it's not that the root of bitterness springs up in one person and it contaminates them. What he's saying is if a root of bitterness were to come up, it's going to collectively damage the entire assembly. Okay, that's accurate how we see that. That's what he's saying here. He's saying, but he's not saying that this root of bitterness is in you. It's that there is this root of bitterness in the assembly that comes up, and it's going to contaminate and it's going to be detrimental to the whole group. That's what he's talking about here when he says this. But I want you to notice how this is a juxtaposition to what he said previously in the context we read, which is a little ways up. He says in verse 11, he says, "Now no chastening, there's no punishment from God, for the present seemeth to be joyous, but it's grievous," or it hurts. "Nevertheless, afterward it yieldeth," and notice here the connection he's using with the imagery of his wording. "After it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness." You see how there's this juxtaposition? He starts off by saying, God, when he punishes us, that doesn't seem good at first, but it yields a peaceable fruit of righteousness. And the juxtaposition of that, the opposite end of that, he says, if we're not very careful and attentive, then what we're going to end up with, he says, we're going to end up with a root of bitterness. We're going to end up with something that's bringing out bad fruit. This ties back into James, where James talks about the bitterness there, and that you have a fountain, and a fountain can bring both sweet water or fresh water, or bitter or salt water, or undrinkable water. These are all the same basic concepts that we find in a number of places. Jesus talks about a tree that brings forth good fruit and a tree that brings forth bad fruit. It's all the same imagery that he's talking about. And so what Paul in context is saying is, we need to appreciate that chastening of God, that punishment of God, that attention from God that creates in the assembly this tree that's bringing forth good fruit. This has nothing to do with feelings. Does it have anything to do with whether or not someone has stepped on your toes, metaphorically speaking, hurt your feelings, if somebody has somehow damaged you and now you're resentful? That isn't what he's talking about. Something far more real than that and far grander than that. That isn't to say that you having your feelings hurt doesn't matter. That's not what I'm trying to tell you. But it doesn't matter in the grand scheme that he is portraying here. And if you read through Hebrews, you'll find that this is a huge subtext of Hebrews, which is that if the Hebrews were not very careful at this very critical juncture of their faith, they were risking losing the whole nation, which they actually did. I mean, the prophecies of Hebrews actually came to pass. Just as Paul said they would. The ground was torn up and burnt, and everything was destroyed, and they lost everything, just as prophesied in Hebrews. However, at this point, the exhortation is that, and he's saying no one, and that's the example he gives, right? When he says that when they were looking at the promised land, he says in Hebrews, chapter 4, I believe, they're looking at the promised land. He says most of the Israelites were lacking of faith, but not everybody lacked in faith, and yet nobody entered in. And so that's the warning. That if they don't all get on board and they don't all believe together, nobody's going to enter in. You're not going to get in on your own. That's what Hebrews is talking about. He's talking about this collective issue, this collective sense by which the Hebrew nation is dealt with. And they all have to enter in. And so the admonition here, the root of bitterness, as he's saying, is that if you're not very careful, instead of having this living tree, this living root that's producing good fruit, and the whole nation benefiting from it, what you're going to end up having is a root of a tree that brings forth bitter fruit and contaminates everyone, and then everybody suffers from it, and nobody enters. That's what he's talking about here. Far, far beyond in scale than how you feel about somebody who stole from you. Okay. And if you read Hebrews and look at it in the context, you'll find that besides how we interpret the word bitterness, there is nothing in here to make this apply to how it's generally applied. Okay? All right, let's look at the other one. This one is in Ephesians. And it's in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 17. And we're going to read quite a bit, so we'll start here. It says, "This I say therefore, and testify in the Lord, that ye henceforth walk not as other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind, having the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart, who being past feeling, have given themselves over unto lasciviousness, to work all uncleanness with greediness. But ye have not so learned Christ, if so be that ye have heard him, and have been taught by him, as the truth is in Jesus. That ye put off concerning the former conversation the old man, which is corrupt according to the deceitful lusts, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and that ye put on the new man, which after God is created in righteousness and true holiness. Wherefore, putting away lying, speak every man truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another. Be ye angry, and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath, neither give place to the devil. Let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands, the thing which is good, that he may be able to give to him that needeth. Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers. And grieve not the Holy Spirit of God, whereby ye are sealed unto the day of redemption. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you, with all malice. And be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you. All right. So he says that we should put away bitterness and forgive one another. It seems to be that this now is the text we're looking for. Forgiveness and bitterness are tied together. Fine. Let's look at that, and then let's look at the context. So if there is a tie between what we think of as bitterness and forgiveness, it is the opposite of how it's taught. Meaning that we say, forgive one another so that all bitterness will be put away. Paul says, put away all bitterness so you can forgive one another. If that's what he's saying it in that order, right? So it's actually the opposite. The reason why you have bitterness isn't because you haven't forgiven, rather you haven't forgiven because you have bitterness, right? So you have to deal with the bitterness in order to get to the forgiveness. That would be the order of the text, correct? If that's what he's saying. And it is what he's saying in a way, but not the way we like to interpret it often. Because bitterness is not referring to your resentment you have towards somebody for something they might have done to you. That's not what bitterness means in this text. Bitterness in this text is in the same vein as all the other nouns he has in there, right? So what does he say? There are things we should put away, and he has a list of them. Let's look at them again. He says, we'll start here in the first part of the sentence. He says that no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth. What kind should be? But that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers. So what do we need to do for that to happen? Well, what we do, he says, is we let all bitterness and wrath, anger, and clamor, and evil speaking be put away. You see, all these are the same thing. He's talking about the way in which we talk to people. Anger, clamoring, evil speaking, in other words, saying bad things about somebody. And bitterness, being harsh. He's talking about something more substantial than how you feel about something. That's right, he's talking about an action. This, again, is not to minimize the importance of our thought life and what we would call our feelings. I'm not trying to say they don't matter. They affect so much about us. But when Paul is here talking about bitterness, he is talking about something far, far more substantial than that. And he is saying that needs to be put away. We need to control our mouths and control our actions. And that is what and that's why I read from the very beginning, that's why he says we should not walk as the Gentiles walk. He is talking about a complete difference in behavior, in what the old King James would call conversation, right? Which is more than just the way you talk. It's your entire way you comport yourself. He is saying we need to be radically different than the way the Gentiles are. And what is the way the Gentiles are? Well, they behave and speak with bitterness and anger and wrath and clamoring. That's how they do it. We don't. We put that away. And we forgive one another. In the text, one is not dependent on the other. We don't forgive because we've put away bitterness, as if one led to the other naturally. Rather, the entire attitude is that we are the new man, and that leads us to put aside some things and do others. So while they may happen simultaneously or consecutively, it isn't like, well, I can't forgive because I have this bitterness. Because bitterness isn't being handled in the way we do it in our popular culture. It's not being handled the way you're going to hear from it from psychology. This is something more substantial. Now, I am perfectly fine if you want to call what he calls bitterness something else, to make that clear for yourself. Or if you want to call what you call bitterness some other word. That's fine. I don't care what word you use, as long as you understand what we're talking about. That they're not the same thing. They're not the same thing. Now, I'm not saying I'm the word Nazi and we have to come up with new words. I just mean in your mind, if you can comprehend, these are different things. Resentment, feeling bad towards someone is not what he's talking about here. Not that Paul is saying it's okay to feel bad towards somebody. Don't worry about resentment. Not what he's saying. But he's saying there is an issue here that is far greater and more important than that. Let's deal with that. Deal with the feelings later. Okay, one more text, and then we'll talk about what we talk about as bitterness and how to deal with it, because this is something that needs to be dealt with. But I wanted to make clear what it is and what it isn't. So look at one more text. It doesn't actually mention bitterness, but it usually gets lumped in there. So that would be 2 Corinthians chapter 2, and we'll start reading from verse 5. We all know the story. Most people think that this is the man from 1 Corinthians 5 who had sinned, and Paul now, in his sequel, is writing about him. It could be somebody else. It's not 100% certain to be him, but it sure seems like it. But regardless, it's somebody who has sinned, and the church has dealt with them, and now that person has repented, and this is what Paul says. But if any have caused grief, he hath not grieved me, but in part, that I may not overcharge you all. Sufficient to such a one is this punishment which was inflicted of many. So that contrariwise you ought rather to forgive him and comfort him, lest perhaps such a one should be swallowed up with overmuch sorrow. Wherefore I beseech you that ye would confirm your love toward him. For to this end also did I write, that I might know the proof of you, whether you be obedient in all things. To whom ye forgive anything, I forgive also. For if I forgave anything, to whom I forgave it, for your sakes forgave I it in the person of Christ, lest Satan should get an advantage of us. For we are not ignorant of his devices. So it seems, right, for all but lacking the word, that he's talking about what we would think of as resentment or bitterness, and he's saying, we need to forgive people, because if not, you're going to harbor this resentment, and Satan's going to use that, and he's going to torment you, and he's going to get an advantage over you, and that all may be true, but that's not what he's saying. That's not what he's saying. Again, he's talking about something more substantial than that. Look, I think there is little doubt that if we live in resentment and in hurt feelings and in depression, it is going to adversely affect our Christian life and those around us. Absolutely. I have no doubt in my mind that that is true. And that is meaningful and serious. And that's something we're going to deal with in a minute. However, I think there's something far more serious than that. And that is how Satan can get an actual, real foothold both in the church and in the lives of believers through a lack of forgiveness. When you feel, let's use our parallel that we started with. So there are many Christians who go through their life concerned that they've lost their salvation. I've dealt with them for years and years and years. There's Pentecostals are the fastest growing movement in Mexico. And that's great in part because they're real Christians and they're really preaching the gospel. So people are really getting saved. That's wonderful. I'm not criticizing that. However, many of those people that I've dealt with that have been won by the charismatic Christian movement are always fearful that they've lost their salvation. It's a constant fear. The only way you get over that in that movement is becoming cynical, right? Where you no longer are sincere about how sinful you are. And you pretend that you have reached a plateau of spirituality and holiness, that you're never in danger anymore. And that's even worse than living in fear. That's worse, okay? But anyways, they live in fear. Constant fear, constantly worried if they did this, if they did that, I thought this, I didn't do this, and if they've lost their salvation. Now that's a terrible way to live as a Christian, okay? But it's not the end of the world. I've often told my charismatic or Pentecostal friends that Pentecostals are going to be the most shocked people in heaven because they didn't think they were going to go. They thought they lost their salvation. They're going to be stunned to find out they didn't. It's going to be a good surprise. It'll be all right. It'll be okay. It's a lot better than the other surprise, right? It's a whole lot better than to end up in hell and wonder, hey, that wasn't supposed to happen. There's going to be a lot of religious people who are going to get that little surprise. Okay? So while living in that kind of fear and living under the weight of those deceptive feelings is not a good place to be, it is not the end of the world either. That is not the worst thing that you could have. It just isn't. And it's the same way with this. Living with resentment towards people, anger because of what somebody did to you or what you think they did to you, well, that's a terrible way to live. But it's not as bad as what he's talking about here. What he's talking about here is the actual, real, eternal effects of not forgiving somebody. This is real. Imagine if Stephen had not forgiven Paul. Saul of Tarsus was there when Stephen was stoned, held their coats, and as leading member of the Jewish community, essentially he approved it, authorized it. And Stephen forgives him. And you may think that what that did is it atoned somehow in his feelings for what happened. But that's not what that did. That was an actual, real absolution of guilt. Paul would probably, I would think, and he doesn't explicitly state this, so we'll be careful here, but to me it's implied in some places, would probably often feel awful guilty about what he did. It seems to me in a number of places in his epistles, he feels that way. Unworthy. In fact, he says that, right? Least worthy to be called an apostle. I persecuted the church of God. But was Paul guilty for it? Not if they forgave him. So while living under a weight of guilt, living under a resentment, living under bad feelings is not any way any Christian should live. It is far worse to live under real, actual guilt. That's worse. And I believe that the advantage of Satan that he's talking about is not that he can whip you into a frenzy because of how you feel about things. But it's an actual real advantage that we find Satan had over the people of Israel with Balak and Balaam in that whole situation, where they became blood guilty before God, and God himself punished them. Satan couldn't touch them, but he found a way to bring real guilt, not the feeling of guilt, not resentment in their hearts, but real guilt in heaven to the degree that God punished his own nation. I believe that's the advantage. That's the advantage that we have a couple. Let me finish the sentence. That is the advantage, I believe, that Paul is saying we need to be very, very aware of. Not that he's going to whip my feelings and I'm going to feel all depressed. I don't want that. But that, I can feel like the worst person on earth and it not be true. Okay, let's get to the questions. Ron, what's yours? Remind me to repeat the questions. Go ahead. Correct. So Ron asked me, is if a person forgives us in judgment, are we held to account for what we did to them? And the answer is no. If I offend you and you forgive me, whether I ask for it or not, if you forgive me, God wipes that from my account. That is correct. That is what Jesus told the apostles, that what they bind on earth is bound in heaven, and what they loose on earth is loosed in heaven. That's right. Kelly, you had a question. Well, no telling. Oh, I'm sorry. So Kelly's question is, if they had not if the Corinthians had not forgiven this man the way Paul was prescribing to be done, what could God have done? There's no telling. I mean, it's not like there's a manual that says, do you follow, you trace out the route, and then it says this is the end. What he's saying is that's not going to end well. We can look at the parables of Jesus on forgiveness, right? When the man doesn't forgive, he says take him and sell everything and get rid of his family. I mean, it goes really bad for the unforgiving servant. No, but there's a lot of things that can go very bad, and very adverse effects can come from being guilty of sin. So this isn't a punishment for not forgiving. This is a punishment on sin. And we as Christians have the authority of Christ to be intercessors in a real way for people who have done wrong. Because it's a lot more complicated than that. Oh, yes. I'm terrible at that. So the question is, if God forgives basically the question is, if God forgives somebody, then why do we have to forgive them, and why would they be held? Why would they be held accountable for something if God has forgiven them? And that is because it's a lot more complex than to think, well, it's just this one thing. God can forgive them, and then no one else has to. Not necessarily the case. So let me try to. I don't know if it works in reality this way, but here's a simplified model of how we could look at this, in which there is condemnation for sin, which we talk about as being heaven, hell, and when God forgives us, that condemnation is done. But there's also judgment for sin, upon which a whole myriad of outcomes depend upon that judgment, which have nothing to do with condemnation anymore, right? And so we can, like when Paul talks about having things burnt up and having rewards won or lost, all of those things are also part of consequences for sin and righteousness. When we forgive people, we are addressing whatever part corresponds to what we can do. It doesn't absolve. If somebody sins and I forgive them, I see you. If somebody sins and I forgive them, that doesn't mean they're not going to hell. Stephen forgave Paul, but Paul still had to be forgiven by God to deal with another side of the effect of sin, which is the eternal condemnation side. But we can forgive a lost person, and it is meaningful in their life. In a real way, it actually matters. Just like when Paul forgave lost people also. Jesus forgave people on the cross, and that was meaningful at that point. It doesn't mean that they weren't lost. Even Jesus forgiving them, because he was forgiven an offense. So all those people who crucified him weren't immediately saved, even though Jesus himself forgave them. So we see that there's differences in what that forgiveness does. But it's always something real and substantial and eternal. Does that answer your question? Okay, Joseph. Correct. That is exactly. I do not believe that I'm sorry, yes, Linda's saying, repeat it. You're not following the rule. Okay, Joseph's comment would be more of a comment, is that when, say it again. Oh, right, but only. Right, he's reaffirming what we talked about 2 weeks ago, that only believers have the authority given by God to actually forgive. Unbelievers can't. I know that we could sit around and think, well, logically that doesn't exactly make sense, and I find some logical holes in this. The problem is I can't get around the text in which Jesus says, the Son of Man has power to forgive because it was given to him, and as I have received the power, I authorize believers to do this, and they can bind and loose in heaven. I don't find that this is something that men had before that, or that anyone else has in any other way. So for whatever reason, only believers have the authority to forgive. Yes, Madison. No, we should ask. Because that would be a different thing. Oh. I told you I'm terrible at this. We got to get some microphones. That would be cheaper for me than what I'm suffering. Okay, Madison's question is, should we then not ask for unbelievers for their forgiveness? And the answer to that is yes, we should, but we need to understand that what that is actually about. Right? This is going back to the popular view of forgiveness in that they say we're okay. It's not necessarily they have any authority to do this. Ron. That's right. The comment is, or the question is if our authority to forgive is given to us through Jesus Christ. And that is correct. Meaning that God authorized the Son of Man to forgive. That was what Christ's thing was, right? They're like, who can forgive sins but God only? It's a true statement, but he says so that you can know that the Son of Man does have the power to forgive sins. Then he performed the miracle of the paralytic. He gets up and walks, and he's saying, and that's what got Christ's miracles, one of the big things about them were. The reason he did the miracles was to demonstrate that power has been given to men. And we find passages in the Gospels where average people observe that and go amazed that such power had been given to men. They were amazed. So this was an amazing ground shift in how things operated through Christ. And then Christ, when he left, gave to us not only that, but basically all authority in many ways. And so we've been given, and Christians, this comes to where, Christians need to stop walking around like we're nobody. Because it isn't true. We have no influence in the White House or in Congress or in the UN, but we're the only ones with influence in heaven. In God's court, we're the only ones with influence. And you shouldn't think that is why when we pray it matters. And when the unsaved pray, it makes no difference. I love it when lost people say they did an experiment to find out if prayer works. They prayed for 30 days, nothing happened. They go, see, that proved it. Well, that proves something. That proved you're an unbeliever. You haven't proven anything. Okay. Yeah. It's always funny. Okay. Any other questions or comments about that? So Terry asks, basically she's asking, are we able to only forgive things committed against us, or are we able to forgive for the sake of others? No, I don't think so, because Paul says, I forgave it for you, but you still need to forgive it. So again, I find forgiveness in the Bible to be extraordinarily robust. And it's not just the simple thing of, you put a mark on the wall of guilt and I can erase that mark. It's a much more sin and guilt, and by guilt I don't mean the feelings of guilt, I mean actual guilt. Right? Guiltiness before God. All these things are incredibly complex. And it appears to me that there are levels in which forgiveness operates. Because we do find the apostles forgiving for other people. And I don't think that was just apostolic. I think like the example you gave would be accurate. Parents could do so for their kids, in the place of their kids in some aspects. But it's still at the same time he's telling them they also had to forgive. So it's not that, that's the difference between what we would call Roman Catholic doctrine on this and Christian doctrine. That if I forgive something in place of someone else, it doesn't actually relinquish them totally from them also forgiving that. So it's not like the priest can forgive and then it's done and no one else really has any say in the matter. It doesn't actually work that way. It's far more involved. And if you read this 2 Corinthians 2, you'll find just how complex he's talking about. where Christ is forgiving, Paul is forgiving, they need to be forgiving, but Paul forgave for them in the person of Christ forgiving them. So we find this to be a very complex issue. It's certainly way beyond complexity than how it's the popular way of presenting forgiveness, which is, again, I want to reiterate, I really do not like common or popular psychobabble forgiveness. To me, it completely denigrates sin and forgiveness. Yes, Mike. Yes, very good. Correct. Correct. So Mike's comment was that sin is incredibly complex, and that forgiveness needs to mirror that complexity. And that means that while many people may have a part in the complexity of the sin and in the forgiveness, we have to look at our part and worry about that. Yes, Madison. Oh, Joseph. Right. Joseph just pointed out, just real quickly to anyone watching, Joseph just pointed out that in the case of the Corinthian man, he had offended God's law, he'd offended the Corinthian church, he'd offended the elders, he'd offended Paul, who had founded the church. So we could look in there and find all that complexity that Mike was dealing with. Yes, Madison, you had one? Okay, so that's a good question. Madison asks about what about forgiving yourself, and that's also very common, right? If you talk to a psychologist, you need to forgive yourself. I generally do not believe that you can forgive yourself. I do think that Mike pointed out, he brought in a nuance I hadn't considered exactly before, but there is where it talks about the sin against your conscience, right? You sin against your own conscience, and so maybe that could work in. I still don't think so. I do not think you are able to forgive yourself, and I think that the way it's used in the popular sense is completely wrong, which is basically you feel bad, and if you could, it again ties forgiveness to feelings as a solution to feelings by forgiving yourself. Right. Okay, very good. So Joseph points out, I'm bringing microphones next time. This is getting ridiculous, but no, that's good. Don't stop. So Joseph points out that he sees that forgiving yourself would actually be an offense to your conscience, because essentially what you're doing is that you are saying, I'm just not going to worry about what I did wrong. I'm just going to pretend it didn't happen, which is kind of what forgiving yourself is. I don't like the whole concept of forgiving yourself. I've always been against that idea. Um, you repent, God has to forgive you at that point once it gets to that level. Okay, yes, Adrian. Well, so Adrian asks if forgiving yourself would be just a way of shorthand saying, I believe that God has forgiven me. I'm going to live on the faith that God has forgiven me. And that would be fine. Again, like I said, I'm not, when I say I don't like the idea of forgiving yourself, I mean it from a technical point of view. And I have a tendency, I don't look at things through feelings. If you talk to my wife, she'll tell you I'm very like black and white, and I don't care about that. I care about what is technically accurate. And I'm not saying that you're wrong for not being that way. We're just different. But I just do not look at the world that way. So if it's not real, it just does not have any bearing on the way I see things, right? But I do understand, at least to some degree, I feel I'm capable of maybe understanding how people feel about that. And they're like, well, but I'm forgiving myself, and it means that I'm accepting that God has forgiven me. Okay, that's fine. I think, and we're going to get to this in a minute, I think it's legitimate to deal with these feelings, and we need to deal with them. I'm not pretending I don't have them, I do. And so I just don't like putting them in terminology that's inaccurate. Fornication. Fornication is the one we are told. Correct. Yeah. So, okay. So let's move on with how we deal with quote unquote bitterness. Okay? And that's fine. We're going to use the word bitterness because I think we all understand it, right? Which is how, and I'm not talking about the text that we read and the way I think the Bible deals with it. I'm just talking about how you and I would talk about that they're bitter. And what we mean by that is they're resentful. They're angry. They have hurt feelings. Now, I am not minimizing that. Just because I look at the grand scheme of the Scriptures and how it deals with it doesn't mean that I then look at your feelings of hurt and think they don't matter. They matter. They just don't matter that much. Okay? Let's look at them because it is something we have to deal with. We cannot live our Christian life prosperously and effectively if we're constantly in what we would call a state of bitterness. So how do we deal with that? We have very little time, so we're going to run through them quickly. Maybe we'll deal with them more in another study, but let me just give them to you. So I came up with 3 things that I think we have to look at in order to deal with that resentment. How do we get rid of it? If forgiveness doesn't get rid of the resentment, how do we deal with that? Okay, 3 things. I'll give them to you, and then we'll look. I'll mention the passages, the text where I see this. 1 is we need to have perspective. 2 is we need to have acquaintance. And 3 is we need to have faith. So perspective, acquaintance, and faith. Let's talk about those briefly. By perspective, I mean you also offend. So you're angry that someone has hurt you, done something bad to you. And let's talk about real hurt, okay? I'm not saying that it's illegitimate to have resentment for things that aren't real damage. But let's just put it in the context of the worst possible thing we can imagine. Somebody has actually done something very real and very bad to you, and you did not deserve it. Fine. How do you get over how you feel bad towards them? Well, you've done it too. Right? That's what James says. We all offend. Much, in many ways. So, get down off the high horse. Often, our feeling of what we call bitterness is really just this sanctimonious, well, I never. Oh, give me a break. You often. So it's a perspective, right? Putting things into context. We are all sinners. Also, it's putting things into perspective that things are more complex than they often seem. One of the amazing things when you deal with people is you talk to, for instance, marriage is always this way. You talk to the husband, and when you get done talking to the husband, you would just think that when the wife shows up to the counseling, she's going to come in on a broom. She's that much of a witch. But then you talk to the woman, and you think that the man was this horrible ape of a person. Because every side has a point. It is not as simple as the movies make it out to be. Even Hitler had someone who loved him. He had a girlfriend. Now, if you don't have a girlfriend, I'm not saying you're worse than Hitler. I'm just saying Hitler had a girlfriend. I'm just going to leave that there. Paul, think about this. Paul says about the Jews, he says, as concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sakes. That seems pretty straightforward, right? That's pretty clear. They're enemies. Okay, next phrase. But as touching the election, they are beloved. What? Are they beloved? or are they enemies? Yes and yes. Yes and yes. Very complex. We need some perspective about things. Things are complex. Often, you are unaware of all the complexity of the situation. You are only looking at what affected you. And I understand that's normal, natural, but we live in a multidimensional world, and we need to become more aware of the complexity of things, and that will mitigate how you feel about them. Often, you have someone you're very angry against, and then you get to understand, wait a minute, they just had this terrible thing that happened to them that day. And then they behave badly. I'm not justifying them behaving badly, but I can understand why someone would act that way.